The morning sun cast long shadows across the Afghan valley as Staff Sergeant Maria Santos checked her Barrett for the third time. The weight of the 50 caliber rifle felt familiar in her hands, like shaking hands with an old friend. Around her, the forward operating base buzzed with nervous energy. Today's mission would take them deep into Taliban territory, and everyone knew the landing zone they were heading to had been compromised before. Maria had been a sniper for 6 years, but this was her first deployment with the Rangers. The other soldiers still looked at her sideways sometimes, not because she was a woman, the army had moved past that mostly, but because she was replacing Sergeant Martinez, who'd been killed by an IED 3 weeks earlier. Martinez had been their guardian angel, the voice that whispered death from 1,000 yards away. Now she had to fill those boots, and the Rangers weren't sure she could. Captain Rodriguez gathered the team around a dusty map spread across a wooden table. Intelligence says the LZ is clear, but we know better than to trust that completely. The Taliban have been hitting every helicopter that tries to land in this sector. 3 birds down in 2 weeks. He looked directly at Maria. Santos, you'll be our overwatch. Find the high ground and make sure nothing moves that shouldn't move. The plan was simple on paper. A Chinook would drop them at landing zone Falcon, a small clearing surrounded by rocky hills about 15 clicks from their target. From there, they'd move on foot to capture a Taliban commander who'd been coordinating attacks on supply convoys. The problem was that LZ Falcon sat in a bowl, surrounded by perfect sniper positions. It was like landing in the middle of a shooting gallery. Maria studied the satellite photos while the other Rangers prepared their gear. The hills around the landing zone were riddled with caves and rocky outcroppings. Any one of them could hide an enemy sniper or a rocket-propelled grenade team. She traced her finger along the ridgeline, looking for the best vantage point. There, a rocky outcrop about 800 meters from the LZ, with clear lines of sight to all the surrounding hills. Specialist Thompson, barely 19 and on his second deployment, sat cleaning his M4 rifle with shaking hands. "My buddy was on the last bird that got shot down," he said to no one in particular. "Said the RPG came out of nowhere. They never even saw the shooter." Maria looked up from her photos. "That's because they didn't have proper overwatch. Today will be different." She said it with more confidence than she felt, but these young soldiers needed to believe she could protect them. The other Rangers weren't convinced. Sergeant First Class Williams, a grizzled veteran with 15 years in the Army, had made his opinion clear during the briefing. Martinez knew these mountains like his own backyard. He grew up hunting in terrain just like this back in New Mexico. You're from Texas, flat country. No offense, but shooting prairie dogs isn't the same as mountain warfare. Maria didn't take offense because Williams wasn't wrong. She had grown up in Houston, about as far from mountains as you could get in Texas. But she'd trained in every environment the Army could throw at her, from the forests of Fort Bragg to the deserts of Arizona. More importantly, she'd spent the last 3 weeks studying every mission report from this sector, memorizing the terrain, learning from Martinez's notes and the mistakes that had gotten other soldiers killed. The Chinook's engines wound up with their characteristic whine, drowning out conversation on the tarmac. Maria slung her Barrett across her back and grabbed her pack. 60 pounds of gear, ammunition, water, and survival supplies. The rifle alone weighed 30 pounds, but every ounce was worth it if she could keep her brothers in arms alive. As they filed onto the helicopter, Private Jackson, the team's radio operator, grabbed her arm. "Santos, my girl back home is pregnant. This is my last mission before I rotate back to the States. Just make sure I get to meet my daughter okay." Maria nodded, understanding the weight of what he was asking. It wasn't just about protecting the landing zone anymore. It was about making sure Jackson got to hold his baby girl, that Thompson got to see his 21st birthday, that all of them made it home to the people who were counting on them. The flight to LZ Falcon took 45 minutes, following a winding route through mountain passes to avoid known anti-aircraft positions. Maria spent the time studying the terrain below, comparing what she saw to the satellite photos. The mountains were more rugged than the pictures suggested, with countless hiding spots and approaches that an enemy could use. Through her headset, she heard the pilot's voice. 2 minutes to LZ. Overwatch, you ready to earn your pay today?" Maria keyed her radio. "Ready as I'll ever be, Chief. Just get me close enough to that ridgeline and I'll handle the rest." But as the Chinook approached the landing zone, banking hard to avoid a rocky outcrop, Maria saw something that made her blood run cold. Fresh tire tracks in the dirt near the LZ, and what looked like disturbed earth where someone had recently dug fighting positions. The intelligence had been wrong. The Taliban were waiting for them. She grabbed Captain Rodriguez's shoulder and pointed to the tracks. His face went pale as he followed her finger. They were flying into an ambush, and there was no turning back now. The Chinook was already committed to the landing approach, its massive rotors kicking up clouds of dust that would announce their arrival to every enemy fighter within 10 miles. 30 seconds, the crew chief shouted over the engine noise. Maria checked her rifle one more time and said a prayer her grandmother had taught her back in Houston. Today, she would find out if she really had what it took to be a Ranger sniper. The lives of 11 good soldiers depended on her answer. The helicopter touched down hard, bouncing once before settling onto the rocky ground. Before the dust had even begun to settle, Maria was out the door and running toward her chosen overwatch position. She had maybe 60 seconds before the enemy realized they were here and started shooting. 60 seconds to get into position and become the guardian angel her team needed. Behind her, she could hear Captain Rodriguez shouting orders to spread out and find cover. The other Rangers moved with practiced efficiency, but they were exposed in the open landing zone. If the Taliban had positioned themselves well, this could turn into a massacre very quickly. Maria's boots pounded against the rocky ground as she sprinted toward the ridge. Her pack bounced against her back and the Barrett felt heavier with each step, but she pushed through the burning in her lungs. She'd run longer distances in basic training, but never with this much riding on her speed and accuracy. The sound of the Chinook's engines began to fade as it pulled away from the landing zone, leaving them alone in hostile territory. Maria reached the base of the rocky outcrop she'd identified as her shooting position and began to climb. The rocks were loose and treacherous, but she moved with the confidence of someone who'd spent countless hours practicing exactly this kind of movement. As she climbed, her radio crackled to life. "Overwatch, this is Alpha 1. We've got movement on the North Ridge, approximately 1,000 meters. Can you confirm?" Maria reached her position and immediately began setting up her rifle. She flipped down the bipod legs and adjusted them for the rocky surface, then pulled out her spotting scope. Through the powerful optic, she could see what Captain Rodriguez was talking about. 3 figures in traditional Afghan clothing were moving along the ridgeline, but they were carrying AK-47s and what looked like an RPG launcher. "Alpha 1, this is Overwatch. I confirm 3 military-age males with weapons on the North Ridge. They appear to be moving into position to engage the LZ. Can you take them out?" Maria calculated the range, wind speed, and elevation difference in her head. It was a challenging shot, but well within her capabilities. The problem was that taking out these 3 fighters would announce her position to any other Taliban in the area. She'd become the primary target for every enemy sniper and rocket team in the valley. But that was exactly why she was here. Her job wasn't to stay hidden and safe. Her job was to make the landing zone secure so her teammates could complete their mission and get home alive. "Alpha 1, I have the shot. Engaging now." Maria settled behind her rifle and began her breathing routine. Inhale slowly, exhale halfway, hold. Let her heart beat steady. Feel the trigger under her finger. Calculate one more time for wind drift and bullet drop. At this range, even a small mistake would mean a complete miss. Through her scope, she could see the lead Taliban fighter raising his RPG launcher toward the landing zone. In 30 seconds, he'd be ready to fire. The Rangers were still spread out in the open, vulnerable to the blast that would follow. Maria's finger found the trigger. Time to find out if a girl from Houston really belonged with the Rangers. The Barrett's trigger broke clean and sharp, just like it had thousands of times in training. But this time, 11 lives hung in the balance of whether her bullet would find its target across 1,000 meters of mountain air. The 50 caliber bullet left Maria's Barrett at over 2,800 feet per second, cutting through the thin mountain air with deadly precision. She watched through her scope as the Taliban fighter with the RPG launcher suddenly jerked backward, his weapon spinning away into the rocks. One down. The crack of her rifle echoed across the valley like thunder, and immediately the other 2 Taliban fighters began scanning the hills for her position. Maria didn't give them time to find her. She worked the bolt action smoothly, chambering another round, and shifted her aim to the second target. This fighter was trying to use a boulder for cover while bringing his AK-47 to bear on the Rangers below. "Overwatch, we've got more movement on the eastern slope," Captain Rodriguez's voice crackled through her earpiece. At least 6 fighters moving down toward the LZ. Maria took her second shot, watching the Taliban fighter on the North Ridge crumple behind his boulder. The third fighter had disappeared completely, probably crawling away to find better cover. She needed to shift her attention to the new threat. Swinging her rifle toward the eastern slope, Maria quickly spotted the advancing Taliban fighters. They were using a dried creek bed for concealment, leapfrogging from rock to rock as they moved closer to the landing zone. Smart tactics, but they'd made one mistake. The creek bed funneled them into a narrow killing zone where Maria could engage them one by one. Through her radio, she could hear the Rangers below coordinating their defensive positions. Thompson, take Williams and set up behind those boulders on the south side. Jackson, get comms with base and tell them we need close air support. Santos, how many more tangos do you see? Maria counted carefully through her scope. Alpha 1, I count 6 fighters in the eastern creek bed, range 700 meters and closing. They're using good cover and fire discipline. These aren't local farmers with rifles, they're trained fighters. As if to confirm her assessment, one of the Taliban fighters popped up from the creek bed and fired a precise burst from his AK-47. The bullets kicked up dirt near Specialist Thompson's position, forcing him to duck lower behind his cover. These guys knew what they were doing. Maria centered her crosshairs on the fighter who just exposed himself and squeezed the trigger. The Barrett's massive recoil drove back against her shoulder, and through the scope she saw her target disappear back into the creek bed. Whether he was hit or just taking cover, she couldn't tell for certain. Overwatch, we need you to keep those fighters in the creek bed pinned down while we maneuver, Captain Rodriguez ordered. Williams is going to take Thompson and flank them from the south. This was exactly the kind of situation Maria had trained for, but training and reality were two different things. In training, the targets didn't shoot back, and there weren't real lives hanging in the balance. She could feel sweat running down her back despite the cool mountain air, and her hands trembled slightly as she reloaded her rifle. The Taliban fighters in the creek bed were getting closer, and they'd figured out roughly where her shots were coming from. Bullets began whining off the rocks around her position, forcing her to stay lower and limit her exposure. Every time she raised her head to take a shot, enemy rounds came uncomfortably close to her position. Overwatch, you've got a shooter on the West Ridge trying to pin you down, Sergeant Williams reported over the radio. Can you see him? Maria low-crawled backward from her shooting position and used her spotting scope to scan the western hills. It took her several minutes to locate the enemy sniper, just a muzzle flash from a cave mouth about 600 meters away. He was good, probably using a captured NATO rifle based on the accuracy of his shots. This was a problem. The enemy sniper was in a perfect position to keep her pinned down while the fighters in the creek bed advanced on the Rangers' position. She needed to eliminate him quickly, but taking the shot would expose her to return fire from an excellent marksman. Alpha 1, I've located the enemy sniper. I can take him out, but I'll be exposed for several seconds. Need you to provide covering fire on the creek bed when I move. Copy that, Overwatch, on your count. Maria took a deep breath and calculated the shot to the cave mouth. The range was shorter than her previous targets, but the angle was tricky, and she'd only have one chance before the enemy sniper adjusted his position. She'd have to move fast, pop up, acquire the target, fire, and get back to cover before he could return fire. Providing covering fire now, Captain Rodriguez announced, and immediately the Rangers below opened up with their M4 rifles, pouring suppressive fire toward the creek bed. Maria rolled to a new shooting position and quickly brought her Barrett to bear on the cave mouth. Through her scope, she could see the muzzle of the enemy rifle protruding from the shadows. She aimed for the center of the cave opening and fired, then immediately rolled backward as return fire snapped through the air where she'd been lying. Her bullet struck the cave mouth, sending rock fragments flying. She couldn't tell if she'd hit the sniper, but the return fire had stopped for the moment. That would have to be good enough. Overwatch, the fighters in the creek bed are making a push, Williams reported. They're about 400 meters out and moving fast. Maria scrambled back to her original position and peered through her scope toward the creek bed. The Taliban fighters had abandoned their careful approach and were now running from cover to cover, trying to close the distance before the Rangers could reposition. It was a dangerous gamble on their part, but it might work if Maria couldn't stop them. She centered her crosshairs on the lead fighter and fired. The man stumbled and fell, but Maria couldn't tell if he was hit or just taking cover. The other fighters kept coming, their AK-47s chattering as they provided covering fire for each other. 200 meters and closing, Thompson shouted over the radio. Maria could hear the fear in his voice, and she didn't blame him. These Taliban fighters were closing fast, and if they reached the landing zone, the Rangers would be badly outnumbered in close-quarters combat. Maria worked her bolt action and acquired another target. A fighter was using a large boulder for cover, exposing just his shoulder and part of his rifle. It was a difficult shot, but she took it anyway. Her bullet struck the boulder and sent rock fragments flying, forcing the fighter to duck completely out of sight. The enemy sniper in the cave had recovered from her earlier shot and was engaging her position again. Bullets whined off the rocks around her, some coming within inches of her head. She could hear the distinctive crack of a high-velocity rifle, confirming that the enemy sniper was using professional equipment. "Overwatch, you need to move," Captain Rodriguez ordered. "That sniper has your range. Displace to an alternate position." Maria knew he was right, but moving meant abandoning her perfect Overwatch position. From her current spot, she could cover the entire landing zone and most of the surrounding hills. Any other position would limit her fields of fire and reduce her effectiveness. But staying put would mean certain death when the enemy sniper finally got lucky with one of his shots. She gathered her gear and began low-crawling toward a secondary position she'd identified earlier, a cluster of boulders about 50 meters away that would give her cover from the west while maintaining decent lines of sight to the creek bed. As she moved, the Rangers below kept up their covering fire, but Maria could tell they were starting to run low on ammunition. Each soldier only carried a limited number of magazines, and sustained firefights like this one burned through ammo quickly. "Alpha 1, what's the status on close air support?" Maria asked as she reached her new position. "Inbound in 15 minutes, came the reply. "Apache gunships, call sign Reaper 2-1. 15 minutes was an eternity in a firefight. The Taliban fighters in the creek bed would reach the landing zone long before the helicopters arrived. Maria needed to stop them here and now, or her teammates would be overrun. She set up her Barrett in the new position and immediately came under fire from the enemy sniper. He'd adjusted his position too, and his shots were uncomfortably accurate. One bullet struck the rock just inches from her head, showering her with sharp fragments that cut her cheek. Through her scope, Maria could see that the Taliban fighters had reached the edge of the creek bed. They were less than 100 meters from the Rangers' position now, close enough that she could see their faces through her optic. Young men, probably local fighters who'd been recruited by promises of money or threats against their families. She pushed the thought out of her mind and focused on her job. These men were trying to kill her teammates, and she couldn't afford to hesitate now. Maria centered her crosshairs on the closest fighter and fired. This time she saw the impact clearly. The man spun around and fell, his rifle flying away into the rocks. The other fighters hesitated for a moment, unsure whether to advance or fall back. That moment of hesitation was exactly what Sergeant Williams had been waiting for. "Moving now," he shouted over the radio, and Maria saw him and Thompson break cover, flanking around the south side of the creek bed. The Taliban fighters were now caught between Maria's rifle fire from above and the Rangers' assault from the side. Several of them tried to run back up the creek bed, but Maria was ready for them. She fired 3 more shots in rapid succession, each one finding its mark. "Overwatch, you just saved our bacon," Captain Rodriguez said over the radio. "Creek bed is clear, outstanding shooting." But Maria knew the fight wasn't over yet. The enemy sniper was still active in the western cave, and there were probably more Taliban fighters moving toward their position. This was just the first wave of what could be a much larger attack. She reloaded her Barrett and began scanning the surrounding hills for additional threats. Through her scope, she spotted movement on the northern ridge, at least 8 more fighters moving into position with what looked like mortars and machine guns. "Alpha 1, we've got big problems coming our way." Maria's heart raced as she counted the Taliban fighters setting up positions on the northern ridge. Through her Barrett scope, she could clearly see them unpacking what looked like an 82 mortar and a PKM machine gun. These weren't the hastily organized local fighters from the creek bed. This was a well-equipped unit that had been planning this ambush for days. "Alpha 1, I count 8 hostiles on the north ridge with heavy weapons. They're setting up a mortar position approximately 1,200 meters from your location. Captain Rodriguez's voice came back tight with tension. How long before they're ready to fire? Maria watched the Taliban fighters working with practiced efficiency. Two men were assembling the mortar base plate while others unpacked ammunition rounds. Maybe 3 minutes for the mortar, less for the machine gun. They know what they're doing. The problem was range. At 1,200 meters, Maria was at the absolute limit of her Barrett's effective range, especially shooting uphill at small targets. She trained for these kinds of shots, but never in combat conditions with enemy snipers trying to kill her and mortars about to rain down on her teammates. Reaper 2-1, this is Alpha 1, Captain Rodriguez called over the radio. We need immediate close air support on grid reference November Bravo 7742. Heavy weapons emplacement, danger close. Alpha 1, Reaper 2-1, we're still 8 minutes out. Can you mark the target with laser? 8 minutes was too long. The Taliban would have their mortar firing by then, and accurate mortar fire would force the Rangers to abandon their defensive positions. Once they were scattered and running, the machine gun would cut them down in the open. Maria made a decision that went against everything she'd been taught about sniper tactics. Instead of taking careful, deliberate shots from concealment, she was going to have to expose herself completely to engage the heavy weapons team before they could start firing. Alpha 1, I'm moving to a better position to engage the mortar team. Need covering fire on the western cave to keep that sniper's head down. Negative, Overwatch, too dangerous. Wait for air support. But Maria was already moving, carrying her Barrett as she sprinted across the rocky slope toward an exposed boulder that would give her a cleaner shot at the northern ridge. She knew Captain Rodriguez was right. What she was doing was practically suicide. But watching her teammates get torn apart by mortar fire wasn't an option either. The enemy sniper in the western cave spotted her movement immediately. High-velocity rounds began cracking past her position, some so close she could feel the shock waves. Maria dove behind the boulder just as a bullet struck the rock where her head had been a split second earlier. From her new position, she had a perfect view of the Taliban mortar team. They'd almost finished assembling their weapon, and she could see one fighter holding what looked like a mortar round, ready to drop it down the tube. First shot would be a ranging round, but the second and third would be aimed directly at the Ranger's position. Maria steadied her rifle against the boulder and began her breathing routine, even as enemy bullets whined off the rocks around her. Through her scope, she could see the lead Taliban fighter adjusting the mortar's elevation. She had maybe 30 seconds before they fired their first round. The shot would have to be perfect. At 1,200 meters, even a slight error in wind calculation or range estimation would result in a complete miss. And she'd only get one chance before the entire Taliban unit focused their fire on her position. Maria centered her crosshairs on the fighter standing behind the mortar and began her trigger squeeze. Just as she was about to fire, a bullet from the western cave struck the boulder near her head, covering her scope with rock dust and forcing her to duck. Overwatch, you've got to get out of there, Specialist Thompson shouted over the radio. That sniper has you bracketed. Maria wiped the dust from her scope lens and quickly reacquired her target. The Taliban fighter was now holding the mortar round directly over the tube, ready to drop it. This was it, now or never. She fired and through the scope saw the fighter jerk backward, the mortar round falling harmlessly to the ground. The other Taliban fighters scattered, abandoning their weapon as they realized they were under accurate sniper fire from over a kilometer away. But Maria's problems were just beginning. The entire Taliban unit on the northern ridge now knew exactly where she was, and they began pouring concentrated fire toward her position. AK-47 rounds, machine gun bursts, and even RPG rounds started impacting around her boulder. Overwatch, you need to move now, Captain Rodriguez ordered. They're adjusting mortar fire toward your position. Maria looked around desperately for an escape route, but she was pinned down on an exposed slope with enemy fighters shooting at her from multiple directions. The only cover was a narrow gully about 20 meters away, but reaching it would mean crossing open ground under heavy fire. An explosion behind her told her that the Taliban had gotten their mortar working again, even without the fighter she'd shot. The round impacted about 50 meters away, sending rock fragments flying. The next one would be closer. I can't move, Maria reported over the radio. Too much fire, going to have to fight from here. That's when Sergeant First Class Williams made a decision that would change everything. Thompson, Jackson, on me. We're going to assault that ridge and take the pressure off Santos. Negative, Captain Rodriguez shouted. Too far and too much open ground, you'll be cut to pieces. Santos took that shot to save our asses, Williams replied. Now we return the favor, she's bought us time, let's use it. Through her scope, Maria watched in amazement as Williams led Thompson and Jackson in a flanking assault up the northern slope. They moved in perfect bounds, one soldier providing covering fire while the other two advanced, then switching roles. It was a textbook infantry assault, executed flawlessly under enemy fire. The Taliban fighters on the ridge found themselves caught between Maria's long-range fire and the Rangers' close assault. They began to panic, some of them abandoning their positions to escape the crossfire. Maria took advantage of the confusion to engage the machine gun crew. At this range, she could see individual fighters clearly through her scope. She picked out the gunner and fired, watching him slump over his weapon. The assistant gunner tried to take over, but Maria's second shot dropped him before he could get the gun firing again. Overwatch, can you see the mortar position? Williams called over the radio as his team advanced. Maria scanned the ridge through her scope until she spotted the mortar crew trying to relocate their weapon. 200 meters northwest of your position. 3 fighters moving the tube to new position. We'll take them, Williams responded. Maria watched through her scope as Williams and his team reached the ridge line and began engaging the Taliban fighters at close range. The superior training and equipment of the Rangers quickly told, and within minutes the northern ridge was secure. But the fight still wasn't over. The enemy sniper in the western cave was still active, and Maria could see more Taliban fighters moving up the southern approach to the landing zone. This ambush was larger and more coordinated than anyone had expected. Reaper 2-1, this is Alpha 1. We need gun runs on the southern approach, multiple targets advancing on the LZ. Alpha 1, Reaper 2-1 has visual on your position. We see approximately 15 fighters moving up the southern slope. Beginning attack run now. Maria heard the distinctive sound of Apache helicopters approaching fast and low. Through her scope, she could see the Taliban fighters on the southern slope looking up in panic as they realized they were about to be engaged by attack helicopters. The Apache's 30 chain gun opened up with a sound like a giant zipper being pulled. Maria watched through her scope as the high-explosive rounds tore through the Taliban positions, eliminating the threat in seconds. Alpha 1, southern approach is clear, the Apache pilot reported. We're going to work over that cave position on the western ridge next. Negative on the cave, Maria called over the radio. I've got that sniper, he's mine. She'd been trading shots with the enemy marksman for over an hour now, and it had become personal. He was good, probably the best she'd ever faced, but he'd made one mistake. He'd stayed in the same position too long, and Maria had finally figured out his exact location within the cave. The enemy sniper fired again, his bullet striking so close to Maria's head that she felt rock fragments cut her face. But this time, she was ready for him. She'd been tracking his muzzle flashes, calculating the exact angle and position of his rifle. Maria aimed not at the cave mouth, but at a specific spot about 3 feet inside where she calculated the sniper was positioned. The Barrett's .50 caliber round punched through the rock overhang and into the cave's interior. The enemy fire stopped immediately. Overwatch, this is Alpha 1. Outstanding work today. LZ is secure, mission accomplished. Maria slumped against her boulder, suddenly feeling the exhaustion and adrenaline crash that always followed combat. Her hands were shaking, and she noticed for the first time that she'd been wounded, probably by rock fragments from the near misses. Blood was running down her face and arms, but nothing seemed serious. Reaper 2-1, this is Alpha 1. We need immediate medevac for one wounded. Sniper took some shrapnel but is ambulatory. Already inbound, Alpha 1. Bird will be on station in 5 minutes. As Maria began gathering her gear for the medical evacuation, Captain Rodriguez climbed up to her position. Santos, that was some of the finest shooting I've ever seen. You saved all our lives today. Just doing my job, sir. No, that was way beyond just doing your job. What you did today, that's what we'll be talking about in Ranger School for the next 20 years. Maria looked down at the landing zone where her teammates were setting up security for the incoming medevac helicopter. Every one of them was going home alive because she'd been able to make the shots when it counted. Specialist Thompson would get to meet his baby daughter. Private Jackson would see his 21st birthday. Sergeant Williams would get to tell his grandchildren about the day a girl from Houston proved she belonged with the Rangers. The sound of approaching helicopter rotors filled the valley as the medevac bird came in for landing. Maria slung her Barrett across her back and began the climb down to the landing zone. The mission was complete, the LZ was secure, and her Rangers were safe. That's all that mattered. The medevac helicopter settled onto the rocky landing zone with practiced precision, its rotors throwing up clouds of dust that forced everyone to shield their eyes. Maria climbed down from her overwatch position, her Barrett rifle slung across her back and blood still trickling from the shrapnel cuts on her face and arms. Every step sent jolts of pain through her body. Adrenaline was wearing off, and she was beginning to feel the full effects of an hour-long firefight. Captain Rodriguez met her at the bottom of the slope, his face serious. "Santos, the medic needs to check you out before we continue the mission." "Sir, I'm fine, just some cuts from rock fragments. Nothing that'll slow me down." "That wasn't a request, Sergeant. Get checked out." The medic, a soft-spoken soldier named Korsman Martinez, guided Maria to a flat spot near the helicopter and began examining her wounds under a bright tactical flashlight. Most of the cuts were superficial, but a few pieces of shrapnel had embedded themselves in her left arm and would need to be removed at a proper medical facility. "You're lucky," Martinez said as he cleaned and bandaged the worst cuts. "Another inch to the right and that sniper's bullet would have taken your head clean off. As it is, you've got a mild concussion from the rock impacts and you're probably going into shock." Maria felt fine, but she knew better than to argue with a medic. The human body could mask serious injuries during combat, and soldiers had been known to fight for hours with wounds that should have incapacitated them. Adrenaline was a powerful drug, but it always wore off eventually. "How long before I can get back in the fight?" Martinez looked at Captain Rodriguez before answering. "Sir, I recommend immediate evacuation to the forward surgical team. She needs proper treatment and observation for the concussion." "Negative," Maria said firmly. "The mission isn't complete. We still have to capture that Taliban commander, and you need overwatch for the approach to the target building." Captain Rodriguez studied her for a long moment. The original mission plan called for them to move on foot from the landing zone to a compound 5 kilometers away where intelligence indicated the Taliban commander was hiding. It would be a dangerous approach through mountainous terrain, with multiple opportunities for ambushes. "Santos, you've already done enough today, more than enough. Williams can provide overwatch with his M110 sniper rifle." "With respect, sir, Williams is good, but he's not trained for extreme long-range precision shooting. If we run into another situation like today, you need the Barrett and someone who knows how to use it properly." Sergeant First Class Williams, who'd been listening to the conversation while cleaning his rifle, looked up with a grim expression. "She's right, Captain. My effective range with the M110 is maybe 600 meters on a good day. Santos was making shots at over 1,000 meters today in combat conditions under enemy fire. If we hit another prepared position, we're going to need that kind of capability." The medevac pilot approached the group, his helmet under his arm. "Sir, I need to know if your wounded soldier is coming with us or staying with the unit. We've got other casualties to pick up, and we can't wait much longer." Captain Rodriguez made his decision. "Korsman, can she continue the mission safely?" Martinez hesitated, clearly torn between medical protocol and tactical necessity. "Sir, she's taken multiple impacts to the head and she's showing signs of mild shock. Under normal circumstances, I'd evacuate her immediately. But her injuries aren't life-threatening, and if you really need her." "I can do this," Maria said. "Give me some ibuprofen for the headache and let's get moving. Every minute we wait here gives the Taliban commander more time to escape or reinforce his position." The pilot checked his watch. "Decision time, Captain. Either she goes now or you keep her for the duration." Rodriguez looked at Maria, taking in the bandages on her face and arms, the exhaustion in her eyes, and the determined set of her jaw. "Santos, if you stay until we extract at the primary pickup zone. No more medevac opportunities until the mission is complete. Are you sure you can handle that?" "Absolutely, sir." All right then, Rodriguez turned to the pilot. She stays with us, thanks for the ride, Chief. As the medevac helicopter lifted off and disappeared over the ridge, Maria felt a mixture of relief and anxiety. She was staying with her team, but she was also committing herself to completing a dangerous mission while injured and exhausted. The easy choice would have been to take the medical evacuation, but she couldn't abandon her rangers when they might still need her skills. The team spent the next hour planning their approach to the target compound. Intelligence photos showed a traditional Afghan farmhouse surrounded by high walls, situated in a valley about 5 kilometers from their current position. The approach would take them through a narrow canyon with limited cover and multiple choke points where the enemy could set up ambushes. Santos, I want you positioned here. Captain Rodriguez pointed to a ridge overlooking the target compound. It's about 800 meters from the main building, with clear lines of sight to all approaches. Williams will take his team around to the south side, while Thompson and I assault from the north. Maria studied the approach route on the map. The ridge position would give her excellent overwatch capabilities, but getting there meant crossing a valley where she'd be exposed to enemy observation for at least 10 minutes. If the Taliban commander had security teams positioned in the surrounding hills, she'd be walking into another ambush. Sir, what's the intelligence on enemy strength at the objective? Minimal, maybe 6 to 8 fighters, mostly local recruits. The commander himself isn't considered a significant military threat. He's more of a facilitator and coordinator than a combat leader. That worried Maria more than if they'd been facing a company of veteran fighters. Military commanders were predictable. They followed doctrine and made tactical decisions based on training and experience. But facilitators and coordinators were often more cunning, and they had extensive local knowledge that could be used to set up effective ambushes. The approach march to the target area took 2 hours, moving carefully through the rocky terrain to avoid detection. Maria's head pounded with each step, and the shrapnel wounds in her arm had stiffened up, making it difficult to carry her heavy Barrett rifle. But she pushed through the pain, knowing that her teammates were counting on her to provide overwatch for the assault. As they neared the target valley, Captain Rodriguez called a halt and gathered the team for a final briefing. Remember, we want the commander alive if possible. He's got intelligence about Taliban operations throughout this sector, and higher headquarters wants to interrogate him. But if he resists or tries to escape, take him down. The plan was simple but effective. Maria would move into overwatch position while the assault teams got into place around the compound. On Rodriguez's signal, they'd move in simultaneously from north and south, overwhelming any resistance before the defenders could organize an effective defense. Maria separated from the main group and began her solo approach to the Overwatch Ridge. Moving alone through hostile territory was always dangerous, but it was necessary to avoid detection. A full team would be easier for enemy scouts to spot, and they couldn't afford to lose the element of surprise. The climb to the ridge was harder than it looked on the map. The terrain was steep and unstable, with loose rocks that threatened to give way under her feet. Maria's rifle felt heavier with each step, and she had to stop frequently to rest and let her vision clear. The concussion was affecting her more than she'd admitted to the medic. When she finally reached her chosen position, Maria was breathing hard and sweating despite the cool mountain air. She set up her Barrett rifle and began scanning the target compound through her scope. What she saw made her blood run cold. The intelligence had been wrong again. Instead of 6 to 8 local fighters, the compound was crawling with well-armed Taliban soldiers. She counted at least 20 fighters, many of them carrying modern weapons, including what looked like a Russian-made Dragunov sniper rifle and several RPG launchers. Alpha 1, this is Overwatch. We have a major problem. Captain Rodriguez's voice came back immediately. Go ahead, Overwatch. Target compound shows approximately 20 military-age males with modern weapons. This is not the light resistance we were briefed to expect. Recommend we abort and call for reinforcements. There was a long pause before Rodriguez responded. Overwatch, are you certain of your count? Maria counted again, carefully tracking each fighter she could see through her scope. Some were positioned on rooftops, others were manning fighting positions around the compound walls. All of them appeared alert and ready for combat. Confirmed Alpha 1, 20-plus hostiles, well-armed and in prepared positions. They're waiting for us. Another pause, then. Overwatch, we're too far from extraction to abort now. and this commander has been coordinating attacks that have killed a lot of good soldiers. We're going to complete the mission, but we'll need you to thin out their numbers before we assault." Maria understood what Rodriguez was really saying. They were committed now, whether the intelligence was accurate or not. But instead of a quick raid against a lightly defended target, they were about to assault a well-prepared Taliban stronghold with a massively outnumbered force. "Copy that, Alpha 1. Beginning engagement of targets of opportunity." Maria settled behind her rifle and began identifying priority targets. The sniper on the main building's roof would be first. He posed the greatest threat to the assaulting Rangers. Then the RPG teams positioned near the compound gates. If she could eliminate the heavy weapons before the assault began, her teammates would have a fighting chance. Through her scope, she could see the Taliban sniper scanning the surrounding hills with his Dragunov rifle. He was good, moving slowly and methodically as he searched for threats. In a few minutes, he'd probably spot her position and the real duel would begin. Maria centered her crosshairs on the enemy sniper and began her breathing routine. This shot would announce the beginning of the assault, and once she pulled the trigger, there would be no turning back. 20 Taliban fighters against 5 Rangers. It wasn't good odds, but Maria had already proven today that a skilled sniper with a Barrett rifle could change the balance of any firefight. Time to find out if she could do it again. Maria's finger found the trigger of her Barrett rifle as she centered the crosshairs on the Taliban sniper positioned atop the main building. Through her scope, she could see him adjusting his Dragunov rifle, methodically scanning the ridge lines for threats. He was experienced, patient, and deadly, exactly the kind of enemy who could pick off her teammates during the assault. The range was just over 800 meters, a challenging but manageable shot under normal conditions. But Maria's head still pounded from the concussion, her left arm throbbed from the shrapnel wounds, and exhaustion was making it difficult to hold the rifle steady. She'd already fired more rounds today than in most training exercises, and each shot was taking more out of her. She controlled her breathing, let her heart rate settle, and began the slow trigger squeeze that would start the final phase of their mission. The Barrett's trigger broke clean, and Maria watched through her scope as the enemy sniper jerked backward and disappeared behind the building's low wall. Alpha 1 enemy sniper is down, beginning engagement of secondary targets. Immediately, the Taliban compound erupted into activity. Fighters ran from building to building, taking up defensive positions and trying to locate the source of the sniper fire. Maria had maybe 30 seconds before they organized an effective response and started shooting back. She worked the bolt action smoothly and shifted her aim to an RPG team positioned near the compound's main gate. The 2 fighters were frantically trying to get their weapon into position to engage the Rangers' assault teams. Maria's second shot dropped the gunner, and his partner abandoned the RPG launcher to seek cover behind a stone wall. "Overwatch, we're beginning our approach," Captain Rodriguez reported over the radio. "Keep their heads down for the next 5 minutes." 5 minutes was an eternity in a firefight. Maria had already revealed her position with the first 2 shots, and the remaining Taliban fighters were now actively hunting for her. Muzzle flashes began winking from firing positions around the compound as enemy soldiers opened up with AK-47s and machine guns. Most of their fire was inaccurate at this range, but Maria could hear bullets snapping through the air around her position. It only took one lucky shot to end everything, and with nearly 20 fighters shooting at her, the odds were not in her favor. She spotted a Taliban fighter manning a PKM machine gun from behind a low wall and centered her crosshairs on his position. The fighter was smart, exposing only his head and shoulders while he fired controlled bursts toward the approaching Rangers. Maria's third shot silenced the machine gun permanently. "Overwatch, you've got a team trying to flank you from the east," Sergeant Williams called over the radio. 4 fighters moving up the slope toward your position." Maria quickly shifted her scope to the eastern approach and spotted the flanking team. They were using good infantry tactics, leapfrogging from cover to cover while providing mutual support. In a few minutes, they'd be close enough to assault her position with grenades and close-range weapons. She could try to engage them, but that would mean taking her attention away from the compound just as her teammates began their assault. If she let the Taliban fighters in the compound reorganize their defense, Captain Rodriguez and his team would walk into a meat grinder. Alpha 1, I've got flankers moving on my position. Need to displace in 2 minutes or I'll be overrun. Negative, Overwatch. We need covering fire for another 3 minutes minimum. Can you hold? Maria looked through her scope at the flanking team, then back at the compound where muzzle flashes continued to wink from multiple positions. The Taliban fighters had taken cover after losing several of their number, but they were still capable of putting up a devastating defense against the Rangers' assault. I can hold, she replied, knowing it probably wasn't true. Maria made a tactical decision that went against every principle of sniper doctrine. Instead of trying to engage the flanking team, she focused all her attention on supporting the assault. She'd deal with the flankers when they got close enough, and hoped she could eliminate enough defenders to give her teammates a fighting chance. Her fourth shot took down a Taliban fighter who was trying to reposition an RPG launcher. The fifth dropped a machine gunner who'd been pouring accurate fire toward Williams' assault team. With each shot, Maria was buying precious seconds for the Rangers to close the distance and get into effective range with their M4 rifles. 100 meters from the compound, Williams reported. Heavy resistance from the main building. Maria could see what he meant. The Taliban commander had positioned his best fighters in the central building, and they were putting up fierce resistance from prepared positions. Every window seemed to have a rifle barrel sticking out of it, and the Rangers were taking heavy fire as they tried to cross the final stretch of open ground. The flanking team was getting closer now. Through her peripheral vision, Maria could see them moving from boulder to boulder, working their way up the slope. The closest fighter was maybe 50 meters away and closing fast. She fired her sixth shot at a defender in the compound, then quickly shifted her rifle toward the flanking team. The closest fighter was raising his AK-47 to fire at her position when Maria's bullet struck him in the chest, sending him tumbling backward down the slope. The other three flankers immediately took cover and began pouring concentrated fire at her position. Maria was forced to stay low as bullets whined off the rocks around her, preventing her from providing covering fire for the assault teams below. Overwatch, we need suppressing fire on the main building now, Captain Rodriguez shouted over the radio. We're pinned down. Maria raised her head just enough to see through her scope. The Rangers were trapped in the open courtyard of the compound, taking fire from multiple directions. Thompson was down, clutching his leg where a bullet had found its mark. Williams was dragging him toward the limited cover of a stone wall while return fire sparked off the rocks around them. Without thinking about the flankers still shooting at her, Maria rose to a full shooting position and began engaging the defenders in rapid succession. Her seventh shot shattered a window where a Taliban fighter had been firing. Her eighth took down a defender on the rooftop. Her ninth silenced a machine gun position that had been pinning down Captain Rodriguez. The flankers took advantage of her exposure to rush her position. Maria heard their footsteps on the rocky slope behind her and spun around just as the closest fighter reached the edge of her firing position. He was young, maybe 19, with fear and determination written across his face as he brought his AK-47 to bear. Maria's training took over. She dropped her Barrett and drew her sidearm in one smooth motion, putting 3 rounds center mass into the attacking fighter before he could pull the trigger. The second flanker appeared a moment later, and Maria put him down with 2 quick shots to the chest. Overwatch, compound is secure, Williams called over the radio. We need immediate medical attention for Thompson, but the target is in custody. Maria holstered her pistol and picked up her Barrett, scanning the compound through her scope to confirm the area was clear. She could see Rangers moving through the buildings, zip-tying prisoners, and securing the Taliban commander who'd been their primary objective. The mission was complete, but Maria knew she was in bad shape. The firefight with the flankers had taken everything she had left, and the adrenaline crash was hitting her hard. Her hands were shaking, her vision was blurring, and she could feel consciousness slipping away at the edges. Alpha 1, this is Overwatch. Area is secure. I've eliminated. Maria tried to count her targets but couldn't focus long enough to get an accurate number. Multiple enemy KIA, flanking team neutralized. Copy that, Overwatch. Outstanding work. Can you make it down to the LZ for extraction? Maria looked down the steep slope she'd climbed hours earlier. In her current condition, attempting that descent would probably result in a fall that could kill or cripple her. But staying on the ridge wasn't an option either. There might be more Taliban fighters in the area, and she was in no condition to defend herself. Negative Alpha 1, going to need assistance getting off this ridge. Already on the way, Santos. Williams and Jackson are climbing up to get you. 20 minutes later, Maria felt strong hands helping her to her feet as Williams and Jackson reached her position. They'd brought a medical litter to carry Thompson, who'd been shot in the leg during the assault, and they helped Maria make her way carefully down the rocky slope. "How many did you get today?" Jackson asked as they walked. Maria tried to count again but gave up. "Enough, more than enough. Captain says you saved all our lives twice today. First at the landing zone, then during the assault. That Taliban commander had detailed plans for attacks throughout the sector. Intelligence thinks your actions today probably saved hundreds of American and Afghan lives." As they reached the landing zone where the extraction helicopter was waiting, Captain Rodriguez approached Maria with a serious expression. "Santos, I'm putting you in for the Silver Star. What you did today was extraordinary, even by Ranger standards." Maria nodded, too exhausted to respond properly. Awards and recognition seemed unimportant compared to the fact that all her Rangers were going home alive. Thompson would recover from his leg wound. Jackson would get to meet his daughter. Williams would have new stories to tell his grandchildren. The helicopter ride back to base passed in a blur. Maria slumped against the web seating, her Barrett rifle cradled in her arms, watching the Afghan mountains pass beneath them. She'd proven today that a girl from Houston could run with the Rangers, that gender didn't matter when bullets were flying and lives were on the line. More importantly, she'd learned something about herself. Under pressure, when everything was falling apart and good soldiers were depending on her, she could make the shots that counted. She could be the guardian angel that her teammates needed, the voice that whispered death from impossible distances. As the helicopter banked toward the forward operating base, Maria closed her eyes and let herself relax for the first time in hours. The mission was complete, her Rangers were safe, and she'd earned her place among America's elite soldiers. The landing zone had been doomed when they arrived that morning. Taliban fighters in prepared positions, coordinated ambushes, heavy weapons aimed at the most vulnerable targets. By all rights, none of them should have made it home. But they had made it home, because when it mattered most, Staff Sergeant Maria Santos had taken position with her Barrett rifle and made it safe. Sometimes that's all it takes, one soldier in the right place at the right time, with the skill and courage to make the impossible shot. Today, Maria Santos was that soldier,